Hello, everybody. It's me, Kenneth, and I'm here with Phil Mistlberger, or PT Mistlberger. And Phil is the author of 3 books: A Natural Awakening, or Natural Awakening, The Three Dangerous Magi, and his last book came out last year, which is A Rude Awakening. And I will not read out Phil's complete bio because it's really long, and the number of paths that he's explored are really numerous. But suffice to say that he is a transpersonal therapist, he is a workshop leader, and he lives in Canada. So Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ken. Glad to be here.
So Phil, let's kind of stick with the theme of awakening this hour. And I feel like it's 2 approaches that you're taking with your 2 books, Natural Awakening and Rude Awakening. And in Natural Awakening, I guess there was a lot of clarity that you brought out in this process of awakening and enlightenment, or seeking enlightenment, or clarifying what enlightenment is. And in Rude Awakening, you, in a sense, made sure to deal with a lot of common fallacies that are out there today in this day and age about awakening and enlightenment. So maybe let's just start with the very basics, before going into it too deep. Do you want to define awakening for us?
Well, one of the surest models that I like to use for this was Gurdjieff's way of putting it. He had a very simple way of describing the idea of awakening, which is that we're all in a type of prison, but we can't get out of the prison until we first realize we are in a prison. And so the idea, of course, is that we humans are living only a tiny percentage of our potential capacity for experiencing reality and for experiencing the nature of who we really are. And as to what is, let's say, blocking us or impeding us from living that full capacity, this is something that mystics and religious thinkers and philosophers and psychologists have tackled for a long time, all coming up with different views, but all basically agreeing that we're not fully experiencing anywhere near the reality of what we're capable of experiencing. And whether that is thought of as moving from a point A to a point B in terms of a progression, a development of wisdom, understanding, consciousness, or whether that is thought of as we already are that which we seek, but it's merely veiled or covered, much like clouds covering the sun, which is already there. However we think of that is secondary to the reality that there is a process of awakening that occurs as we look deeper into our nature. The old expression, when you're in a burning building, never mind how the fire started, just get out of the building, becomes important here, because the analysis and the speculating and the conjecturing and the philosophizing, theorizing as to how the fire started is really secondary to the practicality of moving out of it. And this is where the work really gets engaged, and this is what separates let's say the theoretical philosopher from the mystic that is actually engaged in the process of uncovering their true nature. Now, I often say one can be a philosopher and a mystic at the same time. There's no problem there, or a philosopher in the true meaning of the word, lover of knowledge and wisdom. However, a lot of philosophies, especially modern academic philosophy, is more hair-splitting details of theory. And what we're really involved in terms of engaging an awakening process, is the practicality of it all. How to get out of that burning building that we're in. Of course, what is the burning building? The burning building is the recognition that we're suffering often unnecessarily, and that we're not living anywhere near the capacity that we can be living.
I just want to cover, Rude Awakening's first hard truth is that it's hard. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, that whole thing with that book was, I'm in my, approaching my mid-50s now, and I started on the spiritual path at a very young age, late teens, early 20s, seriously, and each decade presented certain phases of understanding and growth that I went through. And reaching around the half-century mark, I became aware of the need to use a little more critical thought in terms of applying it towards the limitations of spirituality and of the various approaches to spirituality, of course, as well. And the first thing that became obvious to me was, over the years of being involved, 30 years in various forms of personal growth communities and various spiritual communities and awakening schools, that there's this very sharp distinction between the conventional self and the ideal self that we aspire towards. And many of the early humanistic psychologists became aware of this in the early 20th century. People like Maslow and Rogers and Otto Rank and these guys were becoming aware that there was an issue of the split between the idealized self and the reality of simply what we are. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the humanistic psychotherapies that were developed by those people and that really came into their own sort of in the 1950s and 1960s altered the approach of psychotherapy from having to fix or change ourselves into some idea of normalcy that we should be conforming to a different approach, which was recognizing what's going on for us right now in this moment, simply in this moment. And can there be a deeper, more profound, radical acceptance of what is occurring for us in this moment, instead of always struggling with what we are and trying to match it to some ideal of what we should be? And so that's why I wrote that first hard truth. That's that the whole idea of awakening is much more difficult than people commonly think it is when they pick up their first book on transformational work. Because in the beginning it does seem quite attractive in many ways. The idea that we simply have to study, understand, do this, do that, and there will be these extraordinary changes occurring within us. But as anybody knows who tackles this issue, the matter is much deeper and much more difficult, and because of having to engage all the fine print of everyday living and trying to integrate these understandings and the work with one's daily life. And so the main point that I was making there with that first point is that we have this regular self that we experience ourselves to be, and then this ideal that we aspire towards when we start thinking of spirituality. And if we're not careful, what can easily happen is a split occurs between the two, an artificial split occurs between the two, in which the idealistic self becomes more of a fantasy in our mind that we're not actually living. And so the way we try to live it is we start preaching spiritual principles in a very casual way to people around us. Well, I've read this, I practice this, I've studied that, but so what? Is it making any difference, really? And is the regular self been transformed in any sort of way? Is it even possible to transform the regular self? All these essential questions, have to be looked at. And I recall once one fairly well-known spiritual teacher who traveled around the world doing a little research here and asking questions of spiritual teachers and people who had done transformational work, and wanted to know the nitty-gritty details. Was anybody actually changing? And what he had discovered over time was that when people were honest, when people really confessed and admitted to what sort of transformations had actually gone on in their life over a period of time, that there actually was very little change. Very few people were actually changing. people had gained information, knowledge, had read the books, had some experiences, and that's a whole other thing that we can talk about what these experiences amount to, but that fundamentally there was no real essential change on the inside. And so the problem, of course, with spiritual experiences is that you have what Maslow, for example, called peak experiences, and then they become part of a trophy case, let's say, of experiences that we can talk about, boast about, compare, to define our identity as different from others, and so on and so forth. But again, they're just ornaments. They're not really amounting to anything.
Yeah. Phil,
no fundamental change.
Sorry, before you go on, I want to clarify this term that you're using, the idealized self. Would you say that's the same thing as a higher self? Or what most people think a higher self is?
No, in the term that I mean it by, the idealized self is a fantasy that we aspire towards, and is a false part of personality. So it's a new persona that we. Yeah, it's a fiction. It's a new persona that we develop. The higher self is tricky in terms of terminology, because certainly many people who get involved with awakening teachings don't necessarily care that much for the term higher self, because it involves something that is the idea of something that is above something else, which above what? I mean, what are we really talking about here? If we're seeing beyond the illusion of space and time and separation and so forth, then higher is not a particularly good term. But of course, it's a metaphor. Higher self is a metaphor for a depth of wisdom and a greater clarity, a deeper understanding of true nature, our true nature and what that is. So no, they're different here. Higher self, if it means anything, if it is a metaphor that refers to our actual condition via enlightenment and awakening, then that's fine. But idealized self, as I'm using it, is a fiction that we create in our mind, and is a very common problem among spiritual seekers. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to talk about as well with that train of thought was, I guess we see a lot of actually what I'm seeing in the course community is this adherence to I am not a body, and it's all an illusion. And I guess that also is a parallel with what some people call the neo-Advaita community, where we have these teachers just coming out saying, like, referring to themselves in the third person, saying it's not real, so on and so forth. But do you want to comment on that? Is that what you're saying here, an avoidance to be the lower self, or to abide in that idealized self?
Exactly. The problem with the idealized self, from the spiritual point of view, is that inevitably it involves some sort of a disassociation from physical reality and the body as well, and the body becomes seen to be this this problem that is in the way, and this distraction, which is very much like the old Gnostic views. Was in the Gnostic teachings that arose around the time of Christ, the basic idea was that God didn't create this universe. The true God had nothing to do with this universe. It was created by a false god that they called Ialdabaoth, or the demiurge, which means, the term literally means the architect who built this universe. And this false god is a lesser version of the true God, let's say. And from that stemmed this whole idea that the universe was a series of dimensions working down to the physical level, which were denser and denser and further removed from the true God, who had nothing to do with this world. And that if you wanted to wake up and return back up the pipeline, so to speak, to get back to source, you would be confronted by these forces called archons. And the archons had an actual agenda to keep you asleep. It's very similar to what the Matrix movie was all about, if you recall. There were these agents that showed up,
Agent
right?
Smith,
yeah, exactly, Agent Smith, and they were all about
sunglasses.
They were all about sunglasses. That's right. They were all about keeping you in the dream, keeping you locked into the illusion of the virtual reality, and that they ripped all that off totally from the Gnostic teachings. The Gnostic view is that is that if you try to wake up, you're going to encounter these dragons and monsters on the path, so to speak, or agents in sunglasses that are going to be against you waking up. Now, what happened with that whole model, of course, they threw Christ into the mix. They said Christ was the Redeemer, and he will come down and he will activate the spark of light that is inherent within you, and then you can come back up to source. But with the whole model suffered from a certain problem, which is that because the idea was that the original God, the true God, had nothing to do with this material universe. The material universe was thought to be a negative, and as time went on, the teachings became sort of corrupted, as they tend to do over time, and there entered this view in Gnosticism that the material universe was not just negative, it was actually evil, and so the body was actually evil. And the Course in Miracles has some Gnostic overtones to it, as we all know. It has some very powerful teaching in many ways, but what one has to be aware of in terms of one's approach to it is that Gnostic overtone that suggests that the body is not just an illusion, but that the body is a negative. Now, the Course maintains that the body is neutral, which means essentially it's saying that it's an illusion to be overcome, to be seen through, what have you. But it's very easy for someone who has any sort of psychological blocks in terms of negative self-image, in terms of repressed sexuality, in terms of guilt associated with one's sexuality and so forth, to take that and fuse it to the teachings of the Course, even though the Course is saying explicitly that the body is neutral, but to fuse their own psychological blocks to the teachings of the Course and unknowingly use the teachings of the Course as a way to escape the physical dimension. I don't have to go there, thank God. I've been relieved of the whole thing. I don't have to examine my guilt around my sexuality. I don't have to examine my resistance to being a responsible being in the physical universe, paying my bills and living responsibly and so forth. I can just get out of this whole thing because the Course says, after all we have to do is do our forgiveness work, right, and take back our projections, and we can escape this world. And that's all very well, but it very easily becomes part of that whole idealized self I was talking about. The idealized self, the one who is ascending back to some source that involves escaping all the lessons and conditions of this physical world. And when you get into the whole thing, for example, if I can just go here for a minute, the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve and the serpent, very interesting, that whole story. Now, the Gnostic teaching is that the serpent was not an evil force, but the serpent was actually a liberator or a teacher that has come to provide Adam and Eve with the fruit of knowledge, the tree of knowledge, so that they can develop an ego and differentiate from their parent, which is Father, God, and develop some sense of individuality, which can then lead to their own higher development and so forth. And there's certainly a lot of validity to that, but it also overlooks certain factors that are inherent in that teaching, which is that evil, let's say, is a very real force throughout human history in terms of actions, demonstrable actions. There's no question that there are people that have done evil things and that continue to do evil things. And to dismiss all that and say it's evil's simply an illusion created by fear and belief in this illusory physical universe may be true on a theoretical level, but it doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of the demonstrable and the practical, because as Emerson once said, "Who you are speaks so loudly I can't hear what you say." So, meaning that all the theories in the world and all the philosophies in the world will not alter the reality of what our being is transmitting moment by moment. So there is a reality to this physical world, is what I'm saying, and if we don't address it, then it too easily becomes something that we're simply repressing or trying to bypass. And the Gnostic teachings that the serpent was a liberator, that the physical world is a negative, and so forth, have their merits for sure, but they also have some deficiencies in them. In that they tend to overlook some of the realities that are very obviously part of our existence, and that is how to negotiate reality in a physical world and face up to the things that are demonstrably real around us.
Now, Phil, another theme that I wanted to talk about with you is this fluffy ideas of the New Age, which arguably does lend itself to some aspects of the course community in terms of not really embracing the how should I say, the almost like the clinical approach of Zen and Advaita when it comes to awakening. Do you want to just talk about, let's talk about the New Age and some of the fallacies in the New Age movement?
Well, New Age teachings really began in the late 19th century. In 1894, there was a magazine in England run by A.R. Oraj, who later became a student of Gurdjieff. It was called the New Age. A lot of people don't realize this. The 1910s, 1920s, there was a huge movement towards syncretizing spiritual teachings. And at the end of the 19th century, there was the fin de siècle. It was called the end of the century. That was an interesting period because of the science that was arising in the 18th and 19th centuries. Especially Darwinian evolution and that whole thing. There was a revolt that occurred in the so-called underground, in which mystical teachings sought to bring back the importance of the human being because they thought the human had been decentralized by Darwin. Copernicus had already done that 200 years prior to that, and Galileo, by showing that the Earth is not the center of the universe. And Darwin then showed there's nothing terribly special about the human being. So the human being was being decentralized and pushed aside, and there was something of a desire amongst the romantics and later the mystics and the occultists to return to Shakespeare's man is the measure of all things. We are the center of things, and to bring some of that back. And so in all of that, there was a desire to start unifying spiritual teachings and bringing them all together to reassert the primacy of man, let's say. And then that part receded during the war years, especially the Second Year War years, and then it came back again, in the 1960s and 70s, and especially in the 1980s. And the idea behind it all was legitimate and sincere, which was to take the best of all different spiritual teachings and cross-reference them in a way that was useful and helpful. But of course, the limitation of it all was it resulted in diluting things and making things very superficial, and making people focus on shallower elements of spirituality that that really had very little to do with the depths of the awakening process. And the way I simplify this whole thing in terms of understanding what we're talking about here is in a lot of the New Age approaches, the movement has always been to encourage people to move towards the light, let's say, and towards ease, and to avoid the dark and to avoid effort. And whereas when you look at all the processes of transformation that is recorded by all the great legitimate mystics throughout history, is they always talk about this period, this phase you go through of encountering the darkness. Christ out in the desert facing Satan, Buddha under the Bodhi tree facing Mara, and of course the great poet Dante, who talks about his journey through through the realms, and he begins. Virgil takes him to hell first. He goes to hell, and then purgatory, and then paradise. And that's a metaphor for the whole process of awakening. You face hell first because you have to face into the reality of what you think of yourself, and how intensely negative that can be in terms of negative self-image and self-loathing, which is a part of most people's character structure at some level. And so the process of depth psychology in the truest sense of the word, and the awakening process is one of facing into the darkness first, and then much like the shaman goes out in the desert and has to wrestle with the demon first in order to prior to experiencing the more light realms, let's say, of higher nature. And the New Age teachings tended to avoid that to a large degree. there was more of an emphasis on sort of rushing headlong into the light. And so I'd noticed this over the years because I was, involved in various forms of this over the years, and there was always, the very prevalent sense that the work was superficial, and there was a fear of encountering the darker parts of the psyche. So, and much of this had to do with, say, a feminization of the whole path as well, which was understandable because the human civilization has been locked into a very masculine, patriarchal, religious, philosophies for a long time. And so in the movement of the 1960s human potential through Maslow, Rogers, and others, there was the emphasis was shifted from action to feelings. So the feminine angle was emphasized more, and that was emphasized even more in the 1980s, 1990s New Age movement. The whole thing became feminized, and so you start to experience the neurotic aspect of the feminine, which is overemphasis of feelings and avoidance of action. And the neurotic aspect of the masculine is reverse. It's overemphasis on actions and avoidance of feelings. So the alchemy of the whole process, if you will, is to achieve some kind of a balance between these two. But we're a long way from getting there. We're actually in a phase right now in which the feminization is of the whole thing, let's say, is dominating, and the masculine elements have been sort of cast out for the time being, and are something of a taboo, much like the reverse was true, say, 100 years ago. The feminine approach was more of a taboo then.
This is with regards to the spiritual community.
Yes, the whole, all the transformational work. Yes, exactly. And so, these are all. There's nothing really wrong with any of this. These are all parts of us finding our way through this whole thing. But the weaker parts of the New Age teachings are what I call the fluffy, feel-good spirituality, is based on this idea that if we can just get rid of anxiety, then then everything's okay, and our awakening is proceeding as it should be. And so what happens is that the state of no anxiety gets confused with the awakening process, what I call the proverbial group hug. And the proverbial group hug is reassuring and lowers anxiety. But what happens when you leave the group and are off on your own again? You discover that this is really sort of like a drug that's going to wear off over time, because it's based on, it's a BandAid sort of thing, which is based on the idea that if we can form community, and get together and do work with each other, we will, in essence, lower our anxiety. Why? Because we're replacing our dysfunctional family with a new family that appears to have everything that our dysfunctional family did not have. But in fact, all we're really involved in is lowering anxiety. Mm-hmm. Not that there's anything wrong with having, with being free of anxiety. Obviously, it's a desirable state, but it's not. It's really not what the awakening process is about, because it tends to be a temporary thing.
Yeah.
And so that was what I was differentiating in the book, was between feel-good spirituality and deep awakening. One is based on the feel-good spirituality is based on lowering anxiety, and deep awakening is based on tackling all the blocks that are in the way of us being a truly responsible being in this universe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like going for surgery versus stitching up a wound, and not allowing the wound to actually heal.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. That's a very good analogy. The BandAid Effect, right? And I was emphasizing, the balance between the masculine and the feminine, because the masculine, in its dysfunctional way, will tend to, let's say, to really generalize here, to avoid the BandAid altogether, and want to go straight for the surgery without necessarily using any anesthetic. Whereas the feminine might want to avoid the surgery altogether and just put a Band-Aid on it. Neither one works. One is brutal, the other one avoids things. And so what we're trying to do is go beyond brutality and beyond avoidance of issues, and find that medium,
Sweet spot.
that integrates both aspects, balance.
Do you want to talk a little bit about spiritual community? Because obviously, I know you've been involved in, obviously you were, what do you call it, a sannyasin of Osho? Sannyas? Oh, I don't know what the name is, sorry.
Sannyasin, yeah.
Sannyasin. Do you want to talk about spiritual community? And, okay, I mean, most importantly, how should we approach spiritual community?
Well, the Buddha once said, in order to wake up, you need Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Buddha means, in that context, a teacher, a teacher, somebody who represents the Buddha mind, let's say. Dharma is a system of teaching, right, like a book or a system you're following in this context. And Sangha is the fellowship. And the fellowship is important because while solitary practice has its place, retreats and so forth, and spending time learning to be comfortable with yourself on your own is certainly, obviously, extremely important. From time to time, you need to compare notes and to engage the reality of the physical universe, which is that we're in a body with senses, and we have a social conditioning. We're much like wolves. They're solitary wolves, and we're also pack animals at the same time. And the idea with the birds of a similar feather sort of thing is spiritual community is associating with those who are sincere in their desire to awaken, to challenge anything that's in the way of awakening. And this has traditionally, throughout history, always been very important. But of course, it easily becomes corrupted. If we become fundamentalists in the sense of parroting a doctrine. When monks, when people become monks or nuns and live in monasteries, it often wasn't their own intention for awakening that had them put there. It was often they were there because that fit with the social structure of their life as it was at the time, or certainly in the case of Tibetan monks, many of them were just shipped off to the monastery because that's what you did. Your first son went to the monastery. So was this person who lived as a monk a sincere seeker? In many cases, they weren't. Just because they were wearing a robe and shaved their head, or had committed themselves to living in a monastery or an ashram or what have you, didn't really necessarily imply anything about the level, the intensity, or the sincerity of their intention for awakening. And so what this amounts to, and has often amounted to throughout history, is that the spiritual sangha, the community, becomes just a substitute family, or becomes a way to hide out from the world, to avoid the issues of living in the world. What Gurdjieff called the fourth way, the way of the spiritual householder, being in the world and not of it, so to speak, but still being in the world. The spiritual community can become a way to hide from that part, from being in the world, facing up to the responsibilities of actually being in this world. However, the spiritual community is also, in my experience, is that it's also important, I would even say essential. Because the problem with too much solitary seeking is that you are not conscious of your own blind spots. You can't see them. What good is exploring wisdom, exploring depth psychology, profound meditation, and so forth, if you can never see your own blind spots, because it means there's parts of your own nature in the way of deeper awakening that you're never going to be able to see. So the value of community is that, in theory, community functions as a grouping of mirrors around you that reflect back to you aspects of yourself that you otherwise couldn't see. And this is a very similar process to guru yoga in its highest definition of that term, which the Tibetans developed to a very high level, which is this idea that the teacher always reflects back your highest potential. So they become a mirror in which you can therefore notice when you're getting off focus, so to speak. Now, eventually, you have to see the teacher as nothing. The mirror is thrown out, the teacher is thrown out, and you recognize that you have to, that you have to turn within to your own wisdom and develop that. But community serves as an important stepping stone for seeing psychological blocks, because people, when you live in community with people, they will piss you off, they will annoy you in all sorts of ways, they will frustrate you, they will disappoint you, and many times, most times, when that's happening, it's because of a projection. There's something in us that we're not fully owning or taking responsibility for that they are reflecting back to us. And much like all close relations in life do. Now, in theory and spiritual community, there is in place the technology to work through those projections and blocks with the others, provided they are, willing and committed to, to do this. It doesn't always work that way. Once I ran several communities long ago, and I once had a community of about 40 people in which we were all doing a lot of depth work with each other. And one person came to me once and said, I will break through with everyone in this community, but not that one person over there. And and of course it doesn't work that way. And so, that person ended up leaving, because this is exactly a great metaphor for what happens in the whole process of awakening, right? We want to pick and choose our projections, which ones we can keep, which persons we're going to hang out with and associate with. Gurdjieff and his school, everyone there at that time had to pay him to be there, which was kind of revolutionary. At that time, he was charging money for people to, to be in his school, which I actually thought was very good, because he used to say that unless you pay for something, you don't value it. And I think there was a lot of truth in that. You have to pay through commitment or sacrifice in some way. In the old days, give something up. And in more current times, there's not so much to give up anymore. So people, what they give up is often some money. Anyway, in this story, people were paying him to be there, but there was one man in his community, a Russian named, I think Rakhmilievich was his name, who was notorious for being a button pusher. Nobody could stand the guy wherever he went. He just triggered people left and right. And Gurdjieff paid him to be there because he was so valuable. He said, we need this guy. He was the joker, that Henry VIII's fool, so to speak, that would say things that nobody else would say, and trigger the crap out of people. And
That's
so,
great.
of course, everyone hated him, but at the same time, he was the most valuable part of the whole community, because he made everyone aware of their stuff by being
a shit stirrer, huh?
That's right, exactly.
Now, I actually wanted to come back to a point that you made earlier about guru yoga, and just reading through your book, it seems to me you're a proponent of the guru disciple relationship. Do you want to tell us about this guru disciple relationship? Because obviously in the course community, that's kind of not really looked upon as a good thing. Like, it's kind of like, oh, you got to rely on your own internal teacher, and so on and so forth. Tell us about the guru disciple relationship.
Well, it's a tricky area, because on the one hand, in theory, and here again, we're going to have to get into the whole thing, but contrasting theory with practice, right? Idealized self with reality, practical self, let's say. In theory, nobody needs a guru, because for a lot of good reasons, we can adopt that position. Certainly, many gurus throughout history have and continue to, make serious mistakes, have character defilements and deficiencies, and those mistakes have repercussions with the people around them, from subtle levels to all sorts of serious, spectacular, gross abuses of power. Of course, there's no secret there. And also, more to the point, our consciousness is in itself the truth anyway. So what do we need another person to tell us, that we're already conscious? I'm conscious, and I'm here to tell you that you're conscious. And, that's very nice. So I already know I am conscious. So thank you very much. But it's not so simple, because what does it mean to get out of a prison? And is it possible to get out of prison on our own? And I'm not entirely, convinced that it is. Much like when we go to school, it would be nice if we didn't need teachers to learn math and algebra and geography and languages and so forth. Or when we get our driver's license, it would be nice if we could simply sit in a car and start automatically driving by activating the innate driver from within. But it actually, as we know in life, it doesn't work that way. To learn something, traditionally we have mentors and people that show us something. And so I do believe in a teacher-student relationship on the spiritual path. However, with a lot of caveats and you know, and so forth, which is foremost of which is that we have to understand that in going into the process, there's a very good chance we're going to be disappointed at some point, or disillusioned at some point.
By the guru.
By the guru and by other gurus and by those that are around the guru, and and so on and so forth. And so there, we have to understand that in doing this, we're almost certainly going to have to experience disappointment at some point. Just when one goes to college or university and finds out that one doesn't really like all of one's professors, or that they're not really what one lives up to. I remember having a professor in university long ago that I thought he was great in the class and everything, and then somebody told me afterwards the guy was a notorious egotist and a drunk, and he was terrible if you ever met him at a social event, and these kind of things. And so then it was sort of like, well, so what? I'm still learning things from the guy, and I think there's too much of a big deal put on the whole thing about, oh, you shouldn't have a guru and they're all corrupt and and so on and so forth, and just spend your life.
Well, I mean, it's a very Western idea, isn't it? Like, I'm my own man. I'm very independent. Independent thinking.
Well, exactly. You nailed it there. I mean, our cultural roots are the Greco-Roman roots, and in the ancient Greek and Roman legends were all about gods fighting against the odds, as I say. And they were challenging something. Prometheus, the great figure Prometheus, the archetype of the Western magician, in a sense, the esoteric path, which is that he stole fire from Zeus, right? And Zeus was keeping fire from humanity, and Prometheus steals it and gives it to humanity. For that, Zeus is really pissed off with him and punishes him and ties him to a rock and has a vulture come and eat his liver and all kinds of grotesque things. Yeah, those Greeks were pretty wild.
Lovely.
But it's the myth of fighting against gods, and so the Western psyche is based on individualism, and the American psyche even more so, because the United States, realized its national identity by breaking away from Britain in a violent conflict. We Canadians are a lot more laid back because part of our cultural root, was that we negotiated our way to having an independent nation. We never fought with the Brits. We just negotiated, whereas the Americans fought. So in the United States, there's a very strong ideal towards independence and individualism, which is not, of course, the reality. It's just an ideal. So again, the difference between the ideal and the reality. Very few people live that. I mean, the United States is a good example, as any nation of slavery to an economic system where tiny percentage of people own and control everything else. Everyone else is just functioning to feed the machine. So they're no different from the rest of the world in that regard. But there's this ideal of the individual. And so, yes, it clashes with the Eastern approach, the Eastern model of the guru-disciple relationship, because it seems like giving away power, and it seems like being controlled by someone else, and and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, a lot of things can be missed, a lot of opportunities missed that otherwise could be gained by associating with teachers. And who cares if they're not perfect or not? It's not the point. The point is, what can I learn from this person?
Yeah.
Granted, I'll just add briefly, there are obviously a ton of risks that go with it. I wouldn't deny that for a moment. I mean, you can become attached, to a teacher, and then the whole mechanism of attachment gets activated, and you have to face that whole thing. But I'm not entirely sure that there's any point in avoiding that, because you're going to get attached to others in your life anyway. Friends, lovers, family, attachments are occurring all the time. So attachment to a teacher is just a different flavor of attachment, but you still got to encounter the whole attachment process sooner or later.
Back to the analogy of being in a school. Some people are going to say that, okay, my higher self or the Holy Spirit is my teacher. What would you say to that?
Well, again, it is true, but the the practicality of it is how easily can you realize that? in many traditions, the Holy Spirit, higher self, the holy guardian angel, there are a lot of different names for it, is known to be realized only through a tremendous effort on the part of the seeker. But that seeker, somewhere along the line, usually needs some sort of an inspiration or a role model, let's say. But inspiration is a better word for it. Maybe with Jesus, maybe that was John the Baptist. Who knows? The Buddha had his own. People that inspired him, or certainly provoked him to continue on his path. And whether it was a dead body or a leper or a cripple, or whether it was the original yogis that taught him in the forest that he eventually surpassed, there was still somebody there who was saying, some indication of someone was saying, let's go from point A to point B. So the idea is that the journey from the ego self to the awakened self is fraught with all sorts of perils, but what we usually need is some sort of an inspiration to get going in the first place. You remember the myth of Percival, the Holy Grail. He is living in the forest with his mother, and along comes one day 3 shining knights, and he's fascinated. He comes out, sees these 3 shining knights. He says, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" Well, they tell him they're on the search for the Holy Grail, and he becomes enraptured with this idea of a Holy Grail, and he then tells his mother, "I'm going to join the knights in a search for the Holy Grail." Well, of course, his mother doesn't want him to leave. That is a whole other element of the psychology of the seeker, having to break away from the mother, or what the metaphor for the mother actually means. Because the mother never wants you to leave. The mother always wants you to stay.
Yeah, it's codependent.
Stay home, stay codependent, stay home. But what it really means is perpetuate mediocrity, continue to perpetuate the world as it has always been. And to break away from the conventional, we have to gather courage to follow the shining knights to where they're going. So that's the inspiration. You see, Percival in the myth, he becomes the one who actually finds the Holy Grail because he had the purity of heart to do so, and sincerity of intention as a seeker. But he had to be inspired by something. And what he was inspired by were the 3 shining knights. So those 3 shining knights are a metaphor for guides or teachers that we meet along the way. And their purpose is to inspire us. We may spend one day with them. We may spend 10 years with them. The main thing is to recognize that there are these little guiding lights that will inspire us along the way. I remember, a teaching I had in a truck stop somewhere in a desert in Oregon 25, 30 years ago. I'm sitting in a cafeteria. A guy comes and sits opposite me with dark shades on. Of course, maybe he was an agent. I don't know, but we somehow shared a breakfast together. And he said one thing to me, and it's sort of always one of the things that lodged in me before he went off, and I never saw him again. He said, "The secret to life," he said, "is stay high by your standards, not by anybody else's standards." And see the paradox inherent in that anecdote, because he's saying the secret to life is stay high by your standards, not by anyone else's. So in essence, what he's saying is you don't need any teachers. The teacher's within you. But he himself was a teacher for me in that moment. So there you go. There's the paradox. He's saying you don't need any teachers, but he himself is embodying the teacher in that moment. So he was an inspiration for me. This dude in a truck stop with his shades on who said, "Stay high by your standards."
Would you say that's rather reminiscent of Aleister Crowley, like do what you will, that is the whole of the laws kind of thing?
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Yeah, I mean that he was teaching a very Taoist thing there. He was saying that your true self is the most natural thing in the world, and to do it, to follow your true self, do what thou wilt shall. That all that matters is to follow your true self. In other words, shall be the whole of the law. It means that the only law in the universe is to follow your true self. However, he was also astute enough to recognize that it's nice to say it. It's another thing to entirely walk the path and do it. And he himself went out in the desert once with a friend of his, Victor Newberg, and they were doing these rituals in the desert. And part of the ritual was to employ psychological and magical spiritual techniques to unearth the higher self or the holy guardian angel. And of course, what happened was instead he encountered this demon, which he called Coranzon. And that's the same thing that Christ talks about meeting in the desert, the same thing that Buddha talks about in his awakening process under the banyan tree when Mara shows up and tries to tempt him in so many different ways. Whenever we make a very powerful bid to awaken, the part of our psyche that is opposed to that whole process, all of the conditioning, the so-called mediocre conventional force that wants to pull you back and keep you at home, so to speak, like Percival in the force there, will come up, will be activated, and will say, no, you don't have a right to do this, and that's how you get tested, because you have to push through that. The Buddha's thing with Mara is always a great story, because Mara did all these temptations on him to try to pull him off his intention to awaken. And finally, at the end, Mara tried one last trick, in which was that Mara said, "What right do you have, with all the people suffering in this universe, what right do you have to be so so selfish as to be concerned with only your own enlightenment in the face of all the suffering in the universe?" So, in other words, he tried to lay the ultimate guilt trip on him. And in the legend, the Buddha reaches down and touches the earth with one hand, and calls upon the earth to bear witness to his intention to awaken. And then, with that, Mara is defeated and disappears. Of course, Mara is nothing. Mara is just the shadow of his own psyche that is in resistance to the awakening process. For whatever angle you want to see to that, I am not worthy of awakening, or I will be breaking free of the system that the agents need to keep us in, because I'll be waking up from the illusion and finding out this whole thing is a virtual reality, so to speak, that there's a much greater reality beyond it, getting out of Plato's cave. It all amounts to the same thing. And
you made the same analogy with Jesus, with Pontius Pilate, did you?
Yeah, exactly. Very similar. Well, Satan in the desert. You said Pontius Pilate, right?
Yeah, I mean, like Pontius Pilate was asking Jesus, what is the truth? Yes. And Jesus didn't say anything. I thought that was a great analogy. I mean, a great parallel between the story of Buddha and Mara.
Yeah. There's a good similarity there too. Pilate, in a sense, represents more of the worldly, let's say, social structure that will oppose awakening, whereas Satan in the desert is more of the spiritual, oppositional force. But these things are not to be regarded as enemies. Rather they are testers that sharpen the sword. Because how do you know how sincere your desire is to awaken if you aren't tested by it, right? And it's in the very contrast of things. How do we enjoy warmth by knowing cold? How do we experience compassion by knowing suffering? How do we experience the brilliance and profundities and joys of awakening? By recognizing the part of us that is afraid of it, that is not signed up for the process. And that will show up in the form of the monsters and demons that come into our life and appear to be, opposed to our awakening. But what we have to do is recognize that these monsters and demons are not ultimately out there. They're parts of our own psyche.
Yeah.
Well,
on that note, Phil, I mean, we're coming up to an hour. I mean, I would love for this discussion to go on. Are you okay to go on, or do you want to wrap it up?
Well, maybe just a little bit longer. Is that okay?
I love to talk about I love that you made case studies of enlightenment in rude awakening, and I'm just going to quickly read out a list of 7 which you chose: Socrates, Jesus, Milarepa, Hakuin, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrongly.
Yeah,
Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and the last one, Yeiko Iwasaki. Do you want to? And I really appreciated that, because it kind of is I really think rude awakening is like the modern guide to enlightenment. It's updated. It's diverse, and it's clear. And it's written from your experiences, not written in an academic way, but at the same time surveys a large breadth of traditions. I just really appreciate that approach that you're taking with looking at people who have gone through the path. What was that path like, and in a way learning from the lessons that they went through. Now, I just want to zoom in and focus on Iwasaki. And you were talking about the bull, right? And 10 stages with the bull. And maybe I think that's very, very useful, actually. That's a great kind of, in a way, a summation or a kind of a framework to talk about what the awakening process is like. Do you want to just share with us what the 10 stages are?
Well, the whole thing around the awakening process in the 10 stages is seeing how the bull represents, that part of our mind that is initially seems to be the life force that is going to take us towards awakening, but that ultimately is understood to be something we have to discard. And in those early stages of the man seeing the bull from a distance, and then he sees the footprints, right, and then he gets close to the bull and he touches the bull, and then he rides the bull, and the bull is this wild force of energy, and then he has to tame the bull, and then eventually he lets go of the bull, and then as he lets go of the bull, he has this moment of solitariness where he's totally alone. And he has this profound realization, which then causes him to retreat to a cave in the metaphor, which is the 9th stage, if I remember right. And then ultimately he has to leave the cave and go back into the marketplace. And in some of the parables, he goes back into the marketplace with a bottle of wine. And in others, they actually excise that. It was funny because they apparently, some of their moral conditioning. Yeah, some of their moral conditioning got activated, but initially it was a gourd for wine that he was taking into the marketplace. But all those stages, from the glimpsing the bull at a distance, occurs when we decide that we have this profound realization. Much like Percival in the forest when the 3 shining knights show up. It's very similar to that. The 3 shining knights you could think of as the bull in some ways. It's that initial mysterious inspiration or thought that enters our mind early in the journey where we realize that we haven't been told the whole truth here. And again, to use the analogy of the Matrix in the movie, it's like the scene where Neo is walking up the staircase and the cat walks by, and then a second later the same cat walks by again. And he suddenly realized, whoa, there's a glitch in the program here. That's very much what it's like when we realize there's a glitch in our program. There's something faulty in our understanding of reality. And moreover, the conventional way of proceeding in life is not necessarily going to give it to us. That might be proceeding through academic studies or what have you, or through a certain line of work or achieving status in the world. That is not going to do it for us. There's something else we're seeing here. That bull on the horizon is something that's outside of the whole model altogether that we've been presented. And so we start pursuing the bull. And there's two levels to the parable, because one, it represents the inner movement towards awakening, and it's also a literal parable that describes the meditation process when we sit down and try to watch our own mind. And so we see the footprints on the ground, which is symbolic of an intellectual conviction that this whole thing is real and there's something to it. Others have experienced it. There are others who walk the path of transformation. It's not something I was necessarily taught about in academia. Maybe I have been, but it's really just by note takers that haven't been doing any work on themselves. And so there's a reality to this whole thing, and we start following the footprints. We see the bull and touch it, and touching it is the moment where we have been touched by something, so to speak, that activates something in us that increases our level of enthusiasm. The original definition of the word enthusiasm, the Latin meaning of it, enthuse, was to be filled with God, filled with the joy of God. That's what it meant. So enthusiasm is an important factor in life. The closest correlate for enthusiasm is passion. It's necessary to have passion for truth, or to be enthusiastic about the whole process. And the bull, with its tremendous energy, represents that enthusiasm. And so we pursue the bull, and we eventually get a hold of it, and we jump on top of it and ride it. And of course, once we're on it, then we see how wild the ride is. When we start to encounter the power of our own consciousness and energy, and the energy of life, and the challenges that the mind throws up in resistance to the whole path, and we start to see just how it's more than what we bargained for. And but eventually, if we hang in there, the bull is tamed and becomes an ally of ours. At that point, the power of our psyche starts working for us rather than against us. And that's a significant breakthrough. And that represents in meditation that point when you sit and try to watch your mind, and it just seems to get worse and worse. The monkey mind gets more and more activated. The more you try to watch it, the more activated it gets.
Yep.
That's the bull getting out of control. And eventually, if you hang in there, everything starts to settle. And because your attention is shifting from identification with the story around you, the thoughts, the necklace of Shakti, as it's called in Hinduism, it's being transferred back into Shiva, which is the silent witness on the inside who's watching everything. And that's the moment we're starting to disidentify with the whole drama and dance around us. And at that moment, the bull is then tamed, and then eventually we realize we don't need the bull anymore, so we let it go. And that letting go is symbolic of us understanding that our true nature is not actually separate from everything around us. So we don't have to wrestle so much with the universe. There's a seamlessness we start to realize between what I am and what is around me. And in that seamlessness, the bull is let go of, and then there is a recognition of the intrinsic emptiness of the self and of its non-separation with the totality of existence. And when that recognition is fully realized in its profundity, we can then leave the cave of our solitary journey and go back into the marketplace, because what's the difference? The marketplace is no difference from the cave. But in going back into the marketplace, we're now sharing what we've learned with others. So this is then the path of the bodhisattva. The arhat was the one who stays in the cave and says, I'm getting out of this samsara dimension, but I don't really care about others so much, I just want out myself. The bodhisattva takes it one step further and goes back into the marketplace with his bottle of wine, because he's not afraid to drink and have a good time with others, much like Jesus drinking, hanging out with the whores and the thieves and the petty common people. And or the Buddha leaving his palace and mingling with ordinary humanity, so to speak, becomes an important part of the whole thing, because we now have the skill and the ability to enter into the dream world of others, not change their dream world, not manipulate them, not make them wrong for it, but simply as a way to commune and connect with them. And that's the ideal of the crazy wisdom master. But I should say, should add to that the legitimate crazy wisdom masters are few and far between. Most are just more crazy than wise, let's say. But
she's the only woman on the list as well.
Well, she, is a very interesting case, because I don't for a moment see Yeiko Osaki, and nobody claims in the book either written about her that she, was some perfected being or anything like that. She died, as 25 years of age, just after having an awakening. What she had was a very powerful satori, an initial awakening. And her own master said she would have needed another 7 years to purify her character and to integrate the whole thing, and so on and so forth. But she's still a tremendously inspiring and important figure anyway, because she did all this on her deathbed, and at that age too, which is very uncommon. And the intensity of her effort, plus the connection she had with her Rashi, her Zen guru, Harada, was very moving. And so she's a great motivator to look at her life and say, wow, she can do this. She's sick, she's in bed, she's on her deathbed, and she still has this burning passion for truth. And she has this radical awakening just before she dies. Yeah, it's a wonderful story. Yeah, I mean, the others were all, more or less household names, gurus, and most of them lived to an old age. And so we sort of take for granted, the quality of their being and their realizations. But she was unusual in her life, the brevity of the whole trip, the shortness of it, and the tenacity that she showed in the face of great illness. Yeah.
Well, Phil, we're gonna start wrapping it up. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom. I think it's been a great interview. Do you want to tell people how what's going on with you, how people can get in touch with you, and workshops you're doing, consulting?
I provide private coaching sessions. I have a lot of clients around the world that I work with by Skype and or by phone. These are 1-hour sessions in which we examine the issues of what's in the way of deeper awakening in life, And I also do workshops and talks and signings in different parts of the world. I was in England a year and a half ago, a couple of lovely bookstores in London. One of which I was invited to, and I didn't know where I was going. It was an address of a building above a.
Watkins, was it?
That was one, but this was another one. It was Atlantis Bookshop, and I was invited to this place called the Moot with No Name, and it was a building above a pub. And I think I'm going into a room with a bunch of people who were waiting for me. And there was, for a talk, and there was sure enough, there was a flip chart, and my books were there, Three Dangerous Magi, and there's 40 people sitting in front of me, each of them with an ale in front of them. And I realized I was in a pub. The actual talk was in a pub, and it was one of the best audiences I ever had. So
there you go. All of them, return from the marketplace with the ale.
Yes, but yeah. So I do provide. I run workshops and give talks. I'm going to be giving a talk and a book signing for Rude Awakening at my own bookstore in my own city here, Banyan Books, on October 18th.
Cool.
Thursday night, 7:00.
How much do you charge for one-on-one sessions?
The one-on-one sessions are $100 an hour. That's $100 Canadian an hour. Yeah, and a sliding scale I have for those that are in financial hardship. Do you have a copy of The Rude Awakening there in front of you?
No, it's on my Kindle.
Okay, all right. Oh, you had a Kindle. You read it through Kindle. Yes.
Yeah. I'm all. Yeah, Kindle's great.
Yeah.
Phil, thank you so much. I will certainly put the links to your books on the description page for the YouTube description page. So do leave us a comment for Phil or I on the discussion. Hope you enjoyed this. This is Ken and Phil Mistlberger. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Take care, again. Bye-bye.